Hello world, I am Retro Indie Josh. We're talking about games in story as a lead up to the 8 Bits to Infinity Tell a Story Jam, which will be running from January 12th to January 22nd. If you're interested in spending 10 days creating a game prototype with a story focus, there's a link in the description where you can join the jam. It's open to everyone, whether you're a professional game developer or just interested in trying it out. You can, of course, team up with up to 3 other people. Jams are a great way to learn about game development, and we always welcome new developers who want to learn and grow. So games and story, these things have been intertwined since the earliest days. If we go all the way back to ancient board games like Go and chess, there was always an element of simulating war or battle between the 2 different players. Of course, as we've come into the modern age, the stories have been more clear and more direct and less abstract, but still there is a range of story in games. You have games like Tetris that really don't have story. You can invent one if you want. It's even more abstract than the Go and chess examples, all the way up to something like the modern God of War or Grand Theft Auto or Skyrim, where the story is really laid out for you as you progress through the game. There are even some genres of game that are specifically focused on story, such as interactive fiction, visual novels, kinetic novels. Some of these are pure text, some of them have accompanying pictures, but in the end, the story is the entire game with limited elements of interactivity. We are looking at story in games in the context of Tell a Story Jam, so we'll be thinking about how these approaches would apply as a solo dev or a small team working with a tight deadline of 10 days. I have 5 different categories that I want to go over. These are categories that I made up myself, so they're open to interpretation, and of course some games could fall into multiple categories or between categories. These are just ways that I like to think about story as it applies to games. The 5 categories that I have are basic framing, dialogue and cutscenes, wordless cutscenes, story in the background, and optional story. So let's start by looking at basic framing. Many games, especially indie games and retro games, use basic framing as a method for delivering story without significant interruption during the game. This is the method where you essentially tell a bit of the story at the beginning, and then at the end of the game, resolve the idea of the story. We see this a lot in the Mega Man series. You can also find it in classics like Super Metroid and Super Mario 64. In the specific case of Mega Man 2, when the game starts, we have an opening cutscene that tells us a bit about the robots and how Wily is attacking, and then when we get to the end of the game, we have Wily defeated, Mega Man wins, the world is saved, and that's the entire story in a nutshell. In Super Metroid, we get an introduction telling us the galaxy is at peace, and then Samus goes off on her adventure, and in the end, the planet explodes. Samus is victorious. In Super Mario 64, we have an opening cutscene and a little bit of text to tell us that Princess Peach has summoned Mario to the castle, and when we enter the castle, we find out, ha ha ha, Bowser has captured Princess Peach, so Mario has to save her. And in the end, Mario saves Princess Peach. We get an ending cutscene and it wraps up the story. This is a great method for minimizing the amount of effort that you put into developing the story if it's not a significant part of your game. For the sake of Tell a Story Jam, this probably won't be enough to qualify as a story-focused game, but these examples provide some insight into how a basic story can be presented in a game without interrupting the gameplay itself. My second categorization is dialogue and cutscenes, which is the most traditional thing that you think of when you think of story in video games. For story-heavy genres like RPGs and visual novels and certain strategy games, most of the text is delivered through character dialogue as well as some narration, and you either have to read it or it's recorded and acted in more modern and high-budget games. This can take a lot of time because not only do you need the characters and the story, you also need to write and edit the actual text itself. And in the case of voice acting, you need voice actors and you need to record those voice actors on top of everything else. This is an option for Tell a Story Jam if your game mechanics are going to be very simple and you're using an engine that already does all the heavy lifting like RPG Maker or similar. But other than that, I would not suggest it as a method for the limited scope of a game jam. Some examples of this include Sea of Stars, which is a traditional RPG, has a lot of text for you to read. Almost almost entirely character dialogue, and also survival horror games like Silent Hill, where most of the dialogue is delivered through voice acting. The third category is wordless cutscenes. I really like these in the context of the Game Jam. Some games have cutscenes and story progresses in them, but they don't necessarily include any text. This can feel a lot less heavy to the player, so they can experience the story without needing to read, and it can also be lighter on the development side because you don't need to write the text, you don't need to edit the text, etc., etc. You see this a lot in retro and indie games. A couple examples we can look at are Batman for the NES, which has fully animated cutscenes with no text, but there is enough action to get an idea of what's happening to give us a context for the gameplay. And one of my favorites, Sonic 3 and Knuckles, where there is not a single drop of text in the entire game outside of menus and UI, and yet it tells a compelling and complex and interesting story throughout. This game also provides an example of my fourth category, which is story in the background. Also another great option for Tell a Story Jam. Remember that games are interactive, so we want to avoid interrupting the player as much as possible. So one way to convey a story without interrupting the player is to simply have it happen behind them or around them in the context of the gameplay. If we look at Lava Reef Act 2 in Sonic 3 and Knuckles, we can see the rise of the Death Egg in the background as you are progressing toward the boss at the end of the stage. This clearly indicates to the player the progression of the storyline without stopping to focus on that element. Of course, with a platformer, you have the advantage that the player has to go through that section because it's relatively linear. And that is the catch with story in the background, is that sometimes it's difficult to get the player to look at the story elements. So you need to design it so that they can miss parts of it if they're able to miss parts of it. The final category of storytelling in games for me is optional story. This is another one that I really like, although it is almost never the only method of storytelling in a game. This is the idea that the story is presented through optional things, like in Doom 3, the PDAs that you pick up, which contain emails and messages and other information that flesh out the story, but you don't need to read any of that. It's hidden away in a menu, and you could happily finish the game without reading a single word of it. But for that reason, this is often a supplement to the more forced versions of storytelling, the four that we previously talked about, and simply fleshes out details that you would otherwise not know about. So those are my 5 categories of storytelling in video games: basic framing, dialogue and cutscenes, wordless cutscenes, story in the background, and optional story. I think in the context of Tell a Story Jam, basic framing would be good, but you have to be careful that it's enough that you can really say your game is story-focused, because sometimes it can feel like the game is without story. Wordless cutscenes is another great option, although you need to be careful, because although you're saving time on words and dialogue, you are going to have to spend more time on visual assets like art and animation. Story in the background is a difficult one to pull off, but if you can, to me, it's the best way to deliver. And then, of course, dialogue and cutscenes is the traditional method, which I'm sure will be the primary form of storytelling in games from the Jam. But I hope that if you are going that route, you are aware of how much work it's going to take, not only to come up with the story, but also write the dialogue, edit the dialogue, make sure the dialogue is good and clear and concise, and all of these wonderful writing things. In addition to the Jam, I have linked some videos in the description that specifically discuss character dialogue and voice. Most of these are meant for writing books or writing films, but it's very beneficial to consider other mediums when you're looking at how to write story for games. The Jam starts on January 12th, which is the Friday after this video goes out. I will be posting a keynote video on that Friday on this channel, so please subscribe if you haven't already. And if you haven't joined the Jam, check out the link in the description. Let me know in the comments if there are other methods of storytelling that I missed, or if there are specific examples of the ones that I talked about that you would like to bring up. I would love to hear all of your ideas, and I really look forward to seeing if there are ways of storytelling that I haven't considered in the Jam. That would be amazing. I have been and always will be Retro Indie Josh. Thank you for watching. I'm super excited about this Jam, and I will see you in the next video.